Hey everybody, I'm Sasha White.
And I'm M.K. Fain.
And this is Identity Crisis. Today we're doing a bonus episode where we're going to be talking about the Equality Act. So M.K., thank you once again for being here to answer our questions. Starting off, what is the Equality Act? Just give us an overview for people who don't know or a refresher for people who don't remember.
Yeah, so the Equality Act is an amendment to a bunch of existing civil rights laws. A lot of people tend to think of it as just a single piece of legislation, but it's actually an amendment to a handful of existing civil rights laws, such as the Civil Rights Law of 1964 and other various civil rights laws that protect people from discrimination on certain bases. So what the Equality Act aims to do is to prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, in addition to protecting other currently protected characteristics such as race, sex, and religion. In reality, what the law is going to do is, while it does a lot of great things for LGBT Americans, on the other hand, it is actually going to essentially take away the right for Americans to have single-sex accommodations or spaces, which is why feminists are very strongly opposed to this.
Mm-hmm. So when you Google the Equality Act and try to find information about it, you typically see gay rights organizations or human rights, civil rights organizations promoting it and saying that this is an essential step in gaining equal rights and protections for gay people. What's so wrong with this if this is advancing gay rights in such a basic, fundamental way?
The problem with this is, while we support, anti-discrimination laws on the basis of same-sex attraction for lesbian, gays, and bisexual people, this law is actually ultimately going to hurt LGBT Americans by institutionalizing a lot of these gender identity policies that actually do more harm than good to people specifically who are often gay or lesbian, especially young children who are gender nonconforming and often turn out to be gay. So it's really unfortunate because the Equality Act has very lofty goals to do things that I think most Americans actually do support. There's a lot of polling that shows that most Americans are very tolerant, that they don't think someone should be fired based on their sexual orientation or face discrimination in public accommodations for this. However, at the same time, it also requires that any place where discrimination on the basis of sex is outlawed, that this also includes discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And it specifically says things such as that when a person is considered for a job, normally you can't discriminate on the basis of sex for a job, but there are exceptions to that. These are called bona fide occupational requirements, or BFOQs. And in a lot of cases, these are very rare circumstances. An example, though, might be a rape crisis center. And what this law does is it says that any time that there is a BFOQ for sex, so for example, saying that someone who works at a rape crisis center with abused women has to be a woman to be a counselor there, that actually has to be interpreted as on the basis of their gender identity. And so if a man identifies as a woman, the rape crisis center would not be allowed to prevent him from becoming a counselor there on the basis of his gender identity. There is no gatekeeping in this. There's no requirement for, actually legally changing your sex and, through any of the methods available. There's no requirement for any sort of actual transition. And it's all purely based on self-identification. This also spreads into areas such as in schools and, and Title IX, which is already under threat thanks to Biden's executive order, and as well as any place of intimacy where there is generally the expectation of privacy on the basis of sex, for example, a locker room, bathroom, a hospital care ward, for example, in certain cases that you would want those to be sex segregated. Prisons, this is a really big concern. Something like 86% of women who are incarcerated are victims of sexual violence themselves. And now those women are going to be forced to be housed with men who are at times sexual predators, and this really puts them at risk. So the Equality Act is really heartbreaking because on one hand, they are giving us this great LGBT anti-discrimination that progressives want. And on the other hand, they're slipping in this gender identity stuff that most Americans do not want. There's robust polling on both a national and statewide level that shows actually cross-partisan disapproval of gender identity policies, exactly like the Equality Act would do. But most Americans actually don't realize that this is what the impact of the Equality Act will be.
Mm-hmm. So, what is the language used in the bill that talks about gender identity, and how does that actually directly affect women's rights?
Yeah, so it's a really big bill. It's amending a lot of different laws, but in general, what it does is it directs the term sex in federal civil rights law to be replaced with the term sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. There's also some areas that are specifically called out as saying that for example, employers must recognize individuals in accordance with their gender identity if sex is a bona fide occupational requirement. And so essentially any place where sex is discussed, it now becomes sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And this is actually very similar to what Biden's executive order did, except that it would be much farther reaching and much harder to undo. But an executive order can easily be undone by the next president. And his executive order that was passed on his first day in office actually can only extend to federal agencies. And there's a lot more that we can do to prevent this sort of thing. For example, the Women's Liberation Front right now has filed a petition to the Department of Education asking them to enforce Title IX on the basis of sex, as the Office of Civil Rights has required. But with this Equality Act, it will become a lot harder because there will be an actual law now, not just an executive order directing policy and regulation changes. It's actually going to change every instance of civil rights law where women are protected on the basis of sex and make that protected on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And this is really disturbing. Even people, I myself, I don't believe that someone should be fired based on a spiritual, religious, or strongly held personal belief that they have, including the belief about what their sex is, even if it's demonstrably false. But this doesn't just extend to saying you can't fire someone because of what their personal belief is or because of what clothes they wear. That's actually already covered also under different Supreme Court rulings. But instead, it's essentially removing the ability for the law to provide a single-sex accommodation space or service. And this extends all the way from things that are federally controlled, like education, into public accommodations, such as, your local gym.
How will this affect women and girls' sports?
It will essentially end them. There will be no such thing as women's and girls' sports anymore. There will be only co-ed sports. And in theory, that equally affects men's and women's sports because men's sports will also be co-ed now because females who identify as male will also be allowed to compete on the male teams. However, in nearly every sport that I can think of, this is really a one-sided benefit. Men are going to outcompete women in sports that exist on any professional level. So essentially what we have is, okay, all sports are co-ed now, but we're still calling them the men's league and the women's league. And no women are actually going to make it to compete in the men's leagues because it's just going to be incredibly rare that you have a biological female who can actually compete against biological males on track, for example. And then you'll have female leagues where half the teams are going to be men. And what was interesting is, that might sound like an exaggeration, but there was a recent committee hearing where we should link this in the description because I forget exactly where it was, but where a member of the ACLU was asked if an entire track team, I think, became all men who identify as women or all boys who say they are girls, would you be okay with that? And the person from the ACLU just repeated, trans women are women. And the idea being that, yes, they would be perfectly okay with there being no such thing as women's and girls sports anymore.
So let's jump ahead 20 years, say, in the future. And if this bill doesn't pass, would you support a women's sports team that would have all transgender biological males as transgender women?
Can you, Representative Skis, can you say that question one more time? I really want to make sure that if I answer, I understand what you're asking.
You bet. Mr. Chair, Ms. Hess. My question is, if we allow, and almost everyone's saying anecdotally there's one or two of these instances, these are super rare. I'd like to jump forward to where maybe they won't be so super rare. So would you agree or would you support an all-women's team having all transgender biological males?
Representative Skis, I will just say, and I apologize if this doesn't answer your question, I don't want to speculate, but what I will say is that transgender women are women, transgender girls are girls, and we are going to support bills that promote and protect their civil liberties and their civil rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll write that down as a yes.
This is not just an issue of, oh, well, people like to kick a ball around the field, so what? Sports don't matter. The UN has recognized sports as a key driver of equality for women and girls for many reasons. One, because they actually promote a lot of positive things about your body and about strength and confidence and self-esteem, but also because it's a signifier of women and girls' position in society, their ability to compete, and also because of the many educational opportunities that are provided through sports. A lot of low-income families do not have a route to higher education except through sports. A lot of girls just don't have a path that they would take to success if it weren't for getting that tennis scholarship or that basketball scholarship. What we're talking about here is essentially saying that all women and girls are forced to compete in all sports against men, and that is true when it comes to professional leagues, when it comes to college tryouts, when it comes to determination for scholarships. And we're already seeing the impact of this. There have already been instances where girls lost competition to men, or boys who were, by the way, losing in the male league and then went to the girls' league and started winning. Shocking. And there's evidence that shows that even when hormonal treatment is undergone by men, that they still do not lose all of the advantages that come with being biologically male and going through male puberty. We also see evidence that even high school boys, the top percent of high school male athletes, are able to outrun consistently Olympic level female athletes. And this is not because the female athletes are not good. It's because their bodies are completely different and not comparable to each other. So, women's and girls' sports are destroyed under the Equality Act. It would be illegal, essentially, to have a female-only athletic league, as long as there's public funding involved. And I think actually even in instances that are considered private.
And what about high school locker rooms and bathrooms? How would this affect them? And how might that in turn affect teenage girls?
They are all co-ed now under the Equality Act. We know how this affects girls because throughout history, we have had to fight for women and girls to have sanitary access across the world. We are still fighting this in many places. And we know that lack of safe sanitary access for women and girls, and being with men and boys is not safe, is a key reason that women and girls are not included in public life. In schools where gender neutral bathrooms have already been institutionalized, we've actually seen children reporting, there's an article about this in The Atlantic in 2019, 3 years ago. We have known that this is happening, but they are reporting, girls are saying that they have to hold it all day long because they're scared to go to the bathroom. We're hearing stories of boys who are going into the girls' rooms and kicking down the stall doors to harass the girls as they go to the bathroom. Imagine you are a 12-year-old girl dealing with your period for, maybe the first time, but even if not, it's still new. You're embarrassed by it. There's loads of stigma around this. And now you have to do that next to a boy. And I mean, it's already hard enough. There are already girls who miss school because of their periods across the world. And yes, even in the United States, girls miss school because of their periods. And this is getting worse as we see more and more gender neutral bathrooms institutionalized. Same with locker rooms, same with essentially any intimate space that used to be sex segregated. It will now be considered discrimination to say that no, a male cannot go in that space.
What can we expect going forward? And if people are not happy with this bill, what might they do to take action?
Yes, so the legislative timeline here is still up in the air, but the Equality Act was proposed on the floor of the House of Representatives this week, which means that they have put it forth and said that we are going to have a vote on this, and presumably when we are releasing this episode, a vote has taken place. So we expect that that vote is going to pass in the House of Representatives. The Democrats have a pretty strong majority there, and every Democrat, I think, if I'm correct on that, has actually signed on as a co-sponsor in the House of the Equality Act. So we have really no question that it's going to pass in the House. There might be some resistance put up by Republicans in the House, for example, proposing amendments or alternatives, things that they hope can at least change the conversation a little bit around these issues. But it's still, as of the time of recording this, unclear as to what exactly is going to happen with that, although we do believe it will pass the House. Now, for a bill to become law, if we remember from our Schoolhouse Rock, after passing the House, it also has to pass the Senate and then be signed into law by the president, or you have to have a veto-proof majority. We don't need to worry about that, or they don't, because Biden has been a very strong proponent of the Equality Act and has said that he will sign this, and is in fact urging Congress to act as fast as possible. The Senate has also said that they will be proposing this bill soon. That they didn't say when they would have a vote on it, and having a vote is actually the big step that we need to wait for in the Senate. The Senate right now is split 50-50 Democrats and Republicans, with Vice President Kamala Harris, of course, being the tiebreaker. This means that Democrats need every single one of their people to be in line in order to get this to pass. There's some question about whether or not some moderate senators will support this. For example, Joe Manchin, a Democratic senator from West Virginia, has already said that he is not totally in favor of everything that's happening in the Equality Act. Women's Liberation Front just put out polling from West Virginia that shows overwhelming bipartisan disapproval of the proposed gender identity policies that would come from the Equality Act in West Virginia. And this includes liberals and Democrats. The most people in this state with this Democratic senator do not want this to pass. So, and there are a few other key senators who we think could be targeted as they don't even have to vote no, they just have to not vote. So if we can get even a single senator to not vote in favor of the Equality Act, then it won't be able to pass the the Senate. Now, it's unlikely that the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, will bring the bill to a vote in the Senate if he is not 100% sure that he has all of his ducks in a row. So I think that if we start to hear that a vote is coming in the Senate, that means that he believes that he has all of the votes to pass the bill, because it would be an embarrassment for the Democrats if they failed to pass it after bringing it to a vote. So what we need to keep an eye out for right now is whether or not all of the moderate Democratic senators are going to sign on. If you want to take action on this, the best thing that you can do right now is to write to your representatives in Congress, and especially to your senators, and especially if you are someone in a state that has a moderate Democratic senator, and tell them that you don't approve of this. Tell them that you want non-discrimination laws for people based on same-sex attraction, but that you don't want to end women's sports, or you don't want to force female prisoners to be incarcerated with violent male offenders. Write to them and express your outrage over this. Also keep an eye out for future actions to come, different alternatives or amendments that may be proposed, because I think that this is something that a lot of people are working on behind the scenes. And it can be hard to tell sometimes what all is actually happening when we only see, the public blow up once something comes out. But just stay tuned, because I think we still have a good chance to fight this, at least as of when we're recording this on Saturday, February 20th. But the main thing is to please write your representatives, please write your senators, and be vocal on this issue. A majority of people do not support gender identity policies like those that would be put into place by the Equality Act. And we're being a silent majority right now. We need to be a vocal majority. We need to change the conversation that it's only a fringe group of people who disapprove of these policies. We need to be clear that this is the mainstream common sense approach that most tolerant Americans want. We want compassion. We want anti-discrimination laws. We don't want the end of women's rights and single-sex accommodations. So please write your senators. There should be a link to the action in the description. And please get vocal. Now is the time.
Okay, my last question is a big one, but why is this being pushed through? If this is not in the interest of women's rights and it's not even in the interest of genuine LGBT rights, who is behind this and whose interest does it serve?
That's a much bigger question. I think it is a cultural badge that people have picked up. I think there's a very loud but very powerful minority of gender ideologues who have pushed this with a lot of money and power behind the scenes. I really recommend people check out the 11th Hour blog by Jennifer Bilek. She has a lot of articles that break down where the funding for this grassroots movement comes from. Spoiler, look up the Arcus Foundation. I mean, there are companies that have a stake in surgical, like cosmetic surgery, fields, who are then funding organizations that push gender ideology and the transition of children. And so where it all comes from, I think the behind the scenes money push is a big thing. But I think that on an individual level, for most of the members of Congress and most of the advocates supporting these laws, I think it comes from a genuine place of not wanting people to be discriminated against or harmed. And I don't think that most of the people who have signed on to the Equality Act, the co-sponsors in the House, want to end women's rights. I don't think they're going into this with malice. I think people overall want to do what is right. And I think that they're doing what they think is right now. I think that because the gender ideology lobby has so much money and power behind it, they've been able to make the public narrative that this is what is right. And so people who want to do the right thing are doing that because they have not heard the other side, or if they've heard it, they've been able to frame it as this is a fringe, this is bigoted, this is hateful, this is not what I am. I don't identify with this. I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, I'm a Democrat. We're the party for equality for all. I think that there needs to be a cultural shift around this, and speaking out, I think, is a huge part of this, that shows that liberal, leftist, women, feminists, people who support anti-discrimination and who want to create a better, more equal society also recognize the needs of having single-sex accommodations in creating that various society. So the more we can get people on the left to speak out about this, I think the harder it will be for the gender identity lobby to convince well-meaning lawmakers that this is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to add that this is one of those cases, it seems to me, where you have a bill with a lot of good stuff and a general good intention, and then it has this little nugget slipped in there of this ill-defined concept of gender identity that will have this huge effect, this negative effect on women's specific sex-based rights and protections that you talked about. And we've seen this time and time again where you have a bill that's overall good and then there's something slipped in there that's absolutely devastating. So that's that's my interpretation of this bill. This is so incredibly contentious because the majority of the conversation about this is if you're against the Equality Act, you are a hardcore conservative, anti-gay bigot. I'm learning about these issues from lesbian women. There are many gay voices speaking out on this and saying that this is bad for women's rights, and it's not actually the big win for gay rights in this one particular regard about gender identity. So this has nothing to do with being anti-gay. And I just want to make that really clear, because it's not easy to parse the information on this Equality Act. So it's really scary to even ask questions about it, because you don't want people to think that you are homophobic.
Yeah, it's okay to recognize that you like a part of something and you don't like the other part. And for some people, maybe they're weighing the pros and cons of that and say, well, you know what? I actually think that the pro to LGBT Americans is greater than the con to women's rights. If that's the analysis that you make, and that's your decision. But I think it's okay to recognize there are pros and cons to this law, and for for feminists like myself, the con to women's rights is something that is also a con to LGBT Americans, because many LGBT, or at least L and B Americans, are women. The women who are the most impacted by a lot of these things are the women who are most vulnerable. We actually also see time and time again in polling that minority groups such as Black and Hispanic Americans are some of the least likely to support these policies across different other demographics, such as their registered political party or ideology or age. This is often because the people who are the most vulnerable in society are the ones who are the most impacted. The people who can afford to just buy a college degree, those people are going to be fine. Like, they don't need a sports scholarship. The people who aren't going to prison, they don't need to be concerned about whether or not prisons are sex segregated. The people who aren't going to homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, the people who can afford to put their kid in the private Catholic school down the street instead of the public school where boys are smashing in the girls' bathroom stalls. The most privileged people in society are the most likely to support these. It's overall, middle-class Americans who are supporting these policies, and yet they're also the least likely to be impacted by them. And I think that if you are a progressive, if you're a liberal, if you're someone who cares about equality and you want to create a better world for Americans who are struggling, then I think that it's important to look at who is really supporting these laws. And a lot of the time, it is not the people who we claim will actually be helped by them. In this case in particular, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, M.K, for explaining everything. And to everyone watching, please keep a lookout, because Wolf will continue to be covering this and letting people know what actions they can take.